Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we are digging into From Russia with Love in the second part of my look at the Sean Connery Bond films. From Russia with Love is held in high esteem in the Bond film canon. In fact, its reputation extends beyond that of just the Bond series to be held in esteem as one of the notable films of the 1960s. Both it and Goldfinger seem to be held in the broader cultural mind as an apex of classic Bond. Goldfinger more for the blockbuster associations, but From Russia with Love in particular for the sort of cinephile audience. It is the film that bears the strongest stamp of Alfred Hitchcock, hence the title of this video. And Hitchcock, obviously, is a revered auteur of the 20th century, and you see some of the influence of that really come to the forefront in From Russia with Love. Stylistically, director Terence Young is not as dynamic as Alfred Hitchcock in his stylistic choices, but is following that same sort of template. In many ways, From Russia with Love is like a Hitchcockian comic book movie with exploitation movie elements. One of the aspects in which it does feel very Hitchcockian is its emphasis on sort of the, there's no easy way to say this, the sort of like darker sexual tones. This is a Bond film that goes into territory that the series would never go into today. This is a film in which Bond is essentially being set up for, like a kind of framed sex murder situation with voyeurism at play, hints of sadomasochism. Obviously, Rosa Kleb, the villain, is kind of coded as a lesbian. You have this strong undercurrent, and then you have like really somewhat exploitative elements with the sequence at the gypsy camp with the women fighting for the love of one man, and then ending up into a menage a trois with Bond. It's really kind of a I don't know. It's got some raw sexual energy in it that the series doesn't really come back to again. Some sort of willingness to kind of lean into that, and it's kind of interesting. And maybe if the series hadn't become such a big blockbuster event with Goldfinger, it might have stayed more in this sort of like darker undercurrent. Certainly, these undercurrents are very prominent in Fleming, but they kind of get toned down as this series goes on, obviously to keep it to a broader audience. This is definitely a fantasy. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of exaggeration here. The characters are heightened caricatures, but there is a sense in which this is a very adult entertainment. More so than I would say even the rest of the series. Dr. No has a lot of fantasy to it that is kind of like heightening it. From Russia with Love is kind of, a little bit slower, not slower, it moves at a much better clip than Dr. No, but it's a little less fantastical is maybe the way I would say it. The intrigue here is very focused on a kind of slow burn tension as the Cold War is kind of heating up in Istanbul. I really appreciate this film as a template of Bond doing this sort of Cold War thriller, because it's actually not a particularly plot-heavy movie. I've talked about how much I love The Living Daylights, which is a very densely plotted movie. From Russia with Love actually has a fairly simple structure, and then it just kind of builds wonderful little episodes along the way. Very colorful. Very much of its time. This is really one of the few films where you feel like you're really entering into a different time and a different place with this character. And I think that's one of the reasons it also holds up so well. Of the films that really lean into travelogue, and there are a number of them, this one has a wonderful commitment to building its story around the local cultural dynamics there. And Bond is kind of along for the ride. People often criticize Goldfinger, which we'll get to in the next video, for Bond being a little bit passive, but he's often pretty passive in From Russia with Love, too. He's kind of dangled out there by M as, you know, Spectre is planning their revenge. They kind of plant a lure for James Bond and MI6 to kind of pull him out. And he's kind of... he doesn't really have his bearings in Istanbul. He's you know, nicely assisted in, you know, with one of the great ally characters in the entire series. But he is kind of finding his bearing, and he's off his game. It's you really see him like on his back foot for a lot of it, even when he knows he's springing a trap, and he's just gotta kind of like wait. So this is actually an interesting thing where From Russia with Love, he's kind of passive just as he is in Goldfinger, but there's just a little bit more tension, I think, sizzling, because you're kind of seeing these machinations kind of come around him. This is Connery's second turn at bat, and you're getting a much different take on the character than you did in Dr. No. Dr. No, he's a very straight, very dark character. Here's where the humor and comfort starts to really come in with the character. You see that in his introduction, this sort of playful humor. You see it in his reaction to M's briefing when M tells him that there's this, you know, Russian cipher clerk that is supposedly fell in love with James Bond's photograph. And Connery has this wonderful aside. It's like, you know, it's you hear that thing about like happening with movie stars, but not with Russian cipher clerks, unless she's mental. And the way Connery says that is just so darkly condescending and funny and amused. Like he's just so he's just kind of very amused throughout the movie at the circumstances in which he finds himself, which is not to say he still doesn't have the darker edge that he did in Dr. No, because he does, but there's a little bit more playfulness and kind of that sardonic quality really coming in to play strongly here in From Russia with Love. And honestly, I think really From Russia with Love and Goldfinger are Connery's best performances the role, depending on whether you want him a little bit darker, which you get in From Russia with Love, or if you want him a little bit more movie star Bond, which we get in full display when we talk about Goldfinger. It's interesting to see Bond here be as... we've talked about like how this movie really kind of leans into some like exploitation film lasciviousness, and you really get the sequence here where during like the gypsy camp sequence where Bond is like really intensely just like fixated on the opposite sex. You know, there's the concept in film criticism and generally art speaking, more broadly speaking, of like the male gaze. And if the male gaze was personified, it's Connery watching the belly dance in From Russia with Love here. It's interesting that this movie really takes time to just kind of like watch characters watching an event. It's kind of like the thing that you don't really get in the Bond movies anymore, but you really get this sort of intense hunger in Connery's eyes. There's definitely a sense in which Connery's Bond feels the most pungently like hedonistic of the Bonds. There's some sort of like primal hunger behind his eyes for sensual pleasures of life, and it really comes out in From Russia with Love. I think you know, this is a film that is a Hitchcockian thriller that has been built very much around like 1960s masculine fantasy. As Fleming said, he wrote for, I think the line is hot-blooded males. And you kind of get that with From Russia with Love. It's like if you took one of Hitchcock's spy thrillers that he did in the 1950s, something like North by Northwest, and you really amped up the kind of violence and the edge of it a little bit more, and created this kind of sensationalistic, masculine-leaning fantasy of the period. And it's kind of interesting to see all the dynamics there that start to play that. Obviously, you have uh, Bond at the center of this kind of dangerous game in which, sex and violence are kind of mingled together. That's always been the through line of the Bond character in ways, like to go for like the pretentious terms, eros and thanatos. Um, this sort of love and death dynamic, these primal forces are always at play in Bond. And From Russia with Love, in a way, is like one of the most focused representation of that, where it is literally Bond being kind of like dangled out there, coming very close to death, but also like, all the sort of like sensual attractions along the way, and then these villains kind of like mirroring that in different ways. Red Grant being presented as a very cold, austere, sadistic person compared to Bond. Rosa Kleb being in play here, partially an M figure because she gets her version of the M briefing with Tatiana Romanova. But also, Blofeld is a little bit of the M figure here. Here, this shadowy guy who never really comes to justice. Kronstein is like, a quintessential Hitchcockian villain character. You could almost see, one of the sort of, mousier, sweatier villains from the Hitchcock catalog just standing in right in his place. This sort of chess master. And it's interesting how the film is structured, too, because you get this fantastically surreal introduction where Bond effectively dies in the first, minute, and then it's revealed to be, a training exercise. This great kind of suspense sequence in the garden is a microcosm of the film. This film is very intentional about like setting this up about this is going to be a game in which Bond is at the center. It does that, and then it immediately shifts over to a chess match, introducing this idea that it's all a strategic game. There's kind of really nice visual ways of representing what is going on here, because there's actually quite a bit of story setup in From Russia with Love, and it moves through it pretty quickly as it gets all the pieces together. It moves through it very efficiently, more so than the novel does, which the novel is great, but it's kind of impressive, actually, how long before James Bond actually appears on screen. Like, he appears as an imposter person in the start of the movie, but there's a good chunk of time where it's just kind of people laying the groundwork for this plot in which Bond is at the center. I find that of the films, I don't really love the character of Tatiana Romanova. I think this is, of the main Bond girls presented, she's the one that's the most disappointing to me because she has the most promising story. This kind of, she's a victim of the situation, really, and is pulled up into something that's far beyond her. And I think the movie doesn't quite know what to do with her. She's caught between being a male fantasy figure, just like so enamored with Bond's raw magnetism, and it is Sean Connery in his prime. Okay, sure, but she's kind of like she gets pretty dopey as the movie goes on, and a little ditzy. The sort of, I don't know, there's kind of a weird undercurrent in their relationship where Bond is like very condescending towards her, and the way that Connery tends to accentuate. And it's not a dynamic I particularly love unfolding in this movie. I'm fonder of some of the other facets of this movie than that core relationship. And I think if anything holds From Russia with Love, it's that back. It's really that relationship isn't strong in the way that it could really give it a little bit more emotional charge in addition to all the sensationalism around it. But that said, it's a functional element of the movie, and I think the set pieces work really well. What this ends up being is a very thrilling game between Bond and his enemies. In this case, Red Grant and Rosa Kleb being the primary antagonist he's facing off again. Also Krylenko, but it's actually, now that we've talked about Krylenko's death, let's bring that up because that's a very interesting set piece in this movie too that I really was struck by when rewatching it. Um, you know, there's an undercurrent of surrealism in Bond, and there's an undercurrent of surrealism in Hitchcock too. Hitchcock, especially by the time you hit the 1960s, is wildly surreal in his approach to movies at times. If you've seen Vertigo and the dream sequence in that, you know that Hitchcock didn't shy away from this sort of grand displays of surrealism in his movies. The bit where Grillenko is killed coming out of a woman's mouth on the wall is such a strange image, such a dramatic way to stage the murder of an individual. It's one of the best sequences in the series just for that. I have to say there are moments in these early Bond movies that are just so visually iconic, so indelible in terms of their images, and not because they're doing the typical Bond fantasy stuff. As much as I love what Ken Adam will bring to the series and the kind of dynamic he'll bring there, what people think of being as Bondian imagery, what's really great about some of these early movies is the intentionality with which they come up with very strange images that are kind of interestingly magnetic. And a set piece where a man is assassinated coming out of a woman's mouth feels appropriately Hitchcockian, but the sensuality of it being a poster of a beautiful woman with this trapdoor in her mouth on the wall is what brings kind of in that Bondian love-death tension that I've talked about before. You know, this sort of tension between those elements being these two primal drives. They're kind of succinctly captured in that single image. Let's talk about Red Grant for a second, because he's kind of the first mirror of Bond in the series that we get. It's not as conscious as it becomes. Like, certainly with 006 and Silva, you're getting a very kind of clear dramatization of this being the anti-Bond. Grant is introduced as a foil for Bond, not in they are one-to-one way, but they're both working professionals. And what's interesting about Grant is just his methodicalness as opposed to Bond's sort of controlled chaos approach. Red Grant is a very methodical, careful, sinister figure, in part because he's so methodical. I think methodical villains tend to come off a little bit more sinister than chaotic ones, just because there's something so calculating about their behavior. Red Grant is a very calculating villain. And it's interesting that we're clued in on the audience as to what he's doing, and knowing that Bond is kind of in this game with this character, and kind of watching them meet and figure out where the other is at during their engagements on the train, climaxing up in the greatest fight of the series, arguably. It's pretty compelling stuff. This is a movie that does not have the standard singular Bond villain figure. It kind of has a cabal of faces that Bond is confronting. And it does really well with establishing Red Grant as being the physical heavy, and Rosa Kleb in particular being the sort of more intellectual villain of the story. Lotte Lenya is such a tremendously dramatic presence, and she gives Rosa Kleb Rosa Kleb is not a tall person. She's not an imposing figure, but there's some sort of darkness in the way that she's portrayed here that gives her something that's almost a little intense. There's a sense in which both these villains, Red Grant and Rosa Kleb, feel among the most authentically sinister of the series, not in an exaggerated way, but in the way that these characters, I should say, really feel like they're cold-blooded people. And it's kind of interesting to see Bond, who's been in this game for a while, kind of respond to Grant with a level of indignation. There's a bit of dialogue there when they're going back and forth in the train, and Bond is, essentially trying to maneuver him into opening the briefcase, which we should talk about. Let's dog ear that and come back to that, because that's the best gadget in the entire series. But where Bond is kind of like really put off by the level of cold-blooded, calculating cruelty that Spectre has really gone to in terms of their planning here. And it's an interesting moment because it's the one moment in the film that tries to like paint Bond as being a little bit more human than the other guys. I think for that reason, that moment, I've heard other Bond fans say that moment always feels false to them. And the writing isn't best. That isn't like the best line Bond has ever been given when he's, what is it he calls them, maniacs or whatever it is. It feels a little bit forced, but you get this sense of Bond still being a character motivated by his duty and these ideals of what, proper behavior are, even as much as we've seen Bond be pretty sadistic himself in the last Bond movie, that there's this sense of like, man, even in a dirty business, this is a dirty play. And Rosa Kleb in particular, the way she is just so ruthless in her own way. She's not even in the movie all that much. And in one of the scenes, she's actually just kind of looking, in a few of the scenes, she's just looking kind of like nervous, kind of like Lashif is. So it's really a testament to a lot of Lenya's presence, that this character can be the final threat of the film and still feel like this menacing figure. She just like the way she walks in with command when she arrives at like Spectre's training facility and meets Red Grant for the time. She carries herself with such authority. You feel like this is a woman who's done some dark stuff, and you get that sense too, how readily she's able to, like at the end of the film, use her Spectre issued poison tipped boot to try to attack Bond, which is again a very Hitchcockian like sequence, and also has this very sort of strange energy. There's this continual strangeness about From Russia with Love. There's the images like Krylenko getting murdered, these spying on the Russians through the catacombs, this climactic fight where Bond is dealing with a woman who's just trying to kick him to death. It's kind of a very strange idea. It could have easily gone astray, but it's actually a very tense scene, and the kind of profuse tension you see on Connery's face and the relief after she's shot by Tatiana is really something for Connery's Bond. It's about as close as vulnerability you get in Connery's Bond. Connery's Bond is not particularly vulnerable in a lot of ways, but in that he is particularly good at showing like getting to the brink of death and showing a bit of that inner panic, and that moment there is one of the best. We'll come back and talk about some of the ones that come up in Goldfinger after that, but there's a sense in which Connery is the Bond who really feels like he gets put through the ringer a little bit, and I really enjoy that. All in all, though, let's just talk about the briefcase real quick. So few of the Bond gadgets are used consistently throughout the story. The briefcase is the best gadget, not just because it's so thoughtfully constructed, there's just so much it does, but because it's used as a key element of like the big Red Grant set piece, but it's used in little ways throughout the entire movie. It really feels like equipment that Bond is using, and it's such an elegant and strange gadget unto itself too. Just like gold sovereigns and a red suitcase with a sniper rifle and a knife. It's like it's the kitchen sink spy equipment, and it just works effortlessly. It's I can't say enough good things about it. It is the best Bond gadget of all time. They've never topped it since, because it's so well incorporated into the movie. But to sum up my thesis about this movie, because we're hitting time here, and I don't like to go too long, even though sometimes I've run on a little bit longer in some of my other videos. This really is like a Hitchcock spy thriller of the 50s, worked into a sort of male fantasy exploitation adventure, so that is really amping up the intensity of this sort of like sex and violence and this sort of like primal drives that are there in the way that you would expect for like a male targeted fantasy in the 1960s. So it is what keeps From Russia with Love being one of the best Bond films is the way it so strongly distills those threads, which are always part of the character, into a fairly succinct, stylish, enjoyable thriller. It is a very primal movie. It is a very, also at times, very elegant movie. You want to spend time in its vision of Istanbul. It's a real interesting, peculiar place, and it has a lot of beauty to it. So that's my thoughts on From Russia with Love. Obviously, we'll be talking about it a little bit more when we talk about Goldfinger, just to contrast the two movies, because they showcase different sides of Connery's Bond. But I think it's fair to say that From Russia with Love is a high watermark for the series in terms of both fulfilling, the Fleming vision in terms of like staying faithful to the Fleming narrative there, building this new cinematic version of the character, and also pulling on broader cinematic themes. Like when we say From Russia with Love is pulling from Hitchcock, it's, Hitchcock I think is a much stronger director than Terrence Young, but this movie acquits itself pretty well. There's a lot of really great first-rate cinema in From Russia with Love that can compete, on that level. And that's not something to be sneered at. There is something here about From Russia with Love that really does stand the test of time as this vehicle for these sort of this sort of storytelling. So let me know what you think about From Russia with Love. Let me know if it's one of your favorite Bond movies. Let me know, if you disagree with anything I've said. You guys are usually pretty good about letting me know if I've said something that you're not totally on board with. But I very much appreciate you watching my videos, especially if you've stuck it out this long. I'm just a talking head here. And I'll happily catch you in the next one where we're going to talk about Goldfinger.